Well, this is a special week. On Friday, we will celebrate the Christmas holidays. And I know this is a very different Christmas from anyone that any of us has ever experienced before. So some of you may have had to change your usual plans and you won't be with family as you are accustomed to, and others are still traveling, and we wish them safe travels. Hope that you return home safely. And we will deal with this as we've dealt with every other event in 2020. We'll try to keep our spirits up and look forward to an end to this disconnectedness and the pandemic and the sickness. And so we are greeting all of you who are here and all who are watching from home, and of course those who are in the back as well. Glad that we can all be together this morning and worship the Lord on the Lord's Day. It is Christmas time, and all the world is recognizing the birth of Jesus Christ. And we're glad that they are recognizing it, although we know the skepticism that is out there. It's a very controversial idea. The incarnation, the idea that Jesus, the Word, became flesh and dwelled among us. And that's a controversy for two principal reasons. The first is, involved in the story of Jesus coming to earth is the virgin birth. The idea that God brought His Son into the world as a human being by Mary conceiving Him supernaturally without the aid of an earthly father. The skeptics look at that and they say that's a myth, that's impossible, which is kind of the point. God, with whom all things are possible, brought His Son into the world in a supernatural way. Even some professing Christians today are questioning whether the virgin birth can be believed. It's just myth, they say, but they argue you can have Christianity without the virgin birth. Well, I disagree with that wholeheartedly. The Bible says Jesus was born according to prophecy of the Virgin Mary, that He came conceived by the Holy Spirit, that He was unusual in the way that He came into the world, just as He was unusual in the way that He went out of the world. He is extraordinary. And I think that's absolutely essential for us to believe. The second reason this is a controversial idea, once you get past the virgin birth, is some people just have a hard time believing that the Son of God condescended to live a normal human life. I mean, imagine that. Until He was about the age of 30, He was just like every other person on the earth. He grew up just like every normal Jewish boy in the city of Nazareth. He lived a normal life. Eugene Peterson once wrote about his first trip to Israel. And he said, "We spent the day in Nazareth looking for Jesus. We walked up and down the narrow streets, took in the market fragrances, entered the tiny synagogue. We saw Him everywhere. Jesus, 8 years old, kicking a soccer ball in the street. The 3-month-old Jesus on a bench near a well, nursing at His mother's breast. Children in a courtyard celebrating the birthday of Jesus at 6 years of age, sitting on a makeshift throne with the crown on His head. The friends dancing around Him, singing and throwing confetti." What he was saying is Jesus was, by all appearances, just an average Jewish boy growing up in Nazareth. And by what we see in the reactions of His family when He came out into the public as the Son of God, He was nothing out of the ordinary. He was just like every other boy or girl, just like His brothers and His sisters. Now, God could have visited humanity any way He chose. Why did He come as a human being? Why send His Son to earth to lead a human life like us and to die on a cross as a criminal in Calvary? Well, our text this morning, Hebrews chapter 2, answers these questions. Because in Hebrews 2, we see a picture of Jesus. Verse 9 in the King James reads, "We see Jesus." And the Jesus we see is the human who died for mankind and gave us hope. And whenever you see a good picture, when you see a painting, you see not only the subject, but all the things that are important to the subject. And as we look at Hebrews 2, we see not only Jesus, but we see ourselves. Principally three things. This is what we're going to note as we go through the text. Number one, we're going to see a picture of what we should have been. Number two, we're going to see a picture of the love of God. And then finally, we're going to see a picture of what we can be. So let's start, first of all, with a picture of what should have been. If you look at verse 5, here's how the text begins in Hebrews 2. For it was not to angels that God subjected the world to come, of which we are speaking. Now, in the book of Hebrews, the subject is the superiority of Jesus, and he begins comparing Jesus to angels, showing that Jesus is superior to the angels. And he's continuing this thought, as you can see, in verse 5 of Hebrews chapter 2. The Jews were obsessed with angels at this point. They talked about them all the time. In fact, in Colossians 2:15, Paul had to warn his readers about the worship of angels. And in the letters to Timothy, you see him warning Timothy against myths. And a lot of these myths we know were myths about angels. For example, there's one that has to do with two princes, one kingly and one priestly, who would come into the world, ushering in the world to come. And you see a reference to that in verse 5 here. And they would, after ushering in the world to come, subject themselves to Michael the archangel, who would rule. That's one of the many myths that were circulating around. And the writer of the book of Hebrews is correcting that a little bit and saying, your myths have it all wrong. It's not to angels that the world to come was subjected. Now, what is this world to come? Well, it's God's new world order. The Messianic kingdom prophesied all throughout the Old Testament, the highest expectations of the people who studied and believed the Hebrew Scriptures. And the writer of the book of Hebrews argues, if you read those prophecies carefully, never do they say that God would subject the world to come to angels. Instead, He would do so to a human being. And after all, this is the way it always has been. This is the way it was in the very beginning. He's purposely using language that echoes Genesis chapter 1. Look at that word, subjected. Do you remember when God created the world, He made man in His own image, and He said, be fruitful and multiply and fill it and subdue it. I've given you dominion over all the works of my hands. And then He says, the Lord saw what He had made, and He said it was good. That's how Genesis chapter 1 ends. With the world, the first created order, being subjected not to angels, but to a human being. Now, he continues in this argument, giving another example from the Old Testament. This is verses 6 through 8. Listen to what he says here. He quotes from Psalm 8. And he says, it has been testified somewhere, that's Psalm 8, what is man that you are mindful of him, or the son of man that you care for him? You made him for a little while lower than the angels. You've crowned him with glory and honor, putting everything in subjection under his feet. You see the word subjection there again. And it's humans to which the world has been subjected. He follows that saying, now in putting everything in subjection to him, He left nothing outside His control. So when God created the world, He put it in the hands of mankind and honored him. And here's what God intended for humanity. Let's go back over that again. Number one, supreme favor. God was mindful of him and He cared for him. Number two, special privilege. He made him for a little while a little lower than the angels. Number three, unique dignity. He crowned him, he says, with glory and honor. And then finally, unrivaled dominion. All things in subjection under his feet. So we see from Genesis 1, from Psalm 8, as the writer of Hebrews argues, this is the picture God intended for man. This is what should have been for humanity. What should have been. But is that what is? Verse 8 continues, sadly, saying, at present, we do not yet see everything in subjection to Him. What does that pronoun Him mean? You might think it refers to Christ, but if you read the Bible, it would contradict the rest of the Bible and what it says about Jesus. Even the book of Hebrews says that Jesus is king. He rules over all. All things have been placed under Him. So everything's in subjection to Him, but what he's saying is, at present, we do not see everything in subjection to humanity, to mankind, to people. It's not as it should have been. Things did not go according to God's intentions. The Creator made the world and all that is in it, declared it good. The artist painted this beautiful masterpiece, and he invited us to participate, to cooperate with him in creation. And we took our paints and we marred the masterpiece with sin. That's what happened. Genesis 3 tells that story. And Adam and Eve disobeyed God. And God says, according to Genesis chapter 3, verse 17, cursed be the ground because of you. Cursed is the ground because of you. And throughout the book of Genesis, there's this interesting relationship discussed between man, the Hebrew word there is Adam, also the proper name of the first human being, man, Adam, and the ground, Adamah. Very similar. And you see God forming man from the dust of the ground. He formed Adam from the dust of the Adamah. See the relationship there? And caused him to till the ground. Genesis 3:23. But man rejected what God asked him to do. He did not obey the Lord's command, and he was cursed. And the ground no longer brought forth fruit freely, but thistles and thorns instead. And humans from that point forward were sentenced to return to the ground. Genesis chapter 3, verse 19. Cursed is the ground because of you. Paul puts it this way in Romans chapter 5, verse 12. Therefore, just as sin came into the world through one man, and death through sin, and so death spread to all men, because all sinned. We sinned, we marred the masterpiece, we rejected what should have been, and the world is broken. The world is fallen. Bad things happen. Things fall apart. People lose their jobs. The poor are hungry. The homeless need shelter. We lose people to death. And who's to blame? We want to blame God for that. It's not God. It's human beings. We sinned, and the world fell apart. That's where this starts, with a picture of what should have been. Let's turn in the second place to a picture of God's love. There's hope. That's not the end of the story. The love of God sent Christ in the flesh to take our place and to fulfill humanity's original design. He didn't simply assume a human form, but when Christ came to earth, He actually became a human. And this is stated over and over again throughout Hebrews chapter 2. Let's look at a few examples. Verse 9, but we see Him who for a little while was made a little lower than the angels. You see the repetition of Psalm 8 here in verse 9, a little lower than the angels, namely Jesus, crowned with glory and honor. Look again at verses 11 and 12. He who sanctifies and those who are sanctified all have one source. Speaking of the Father there. That is why He's not ashamed to call them brothers. Talking about men and women. He calls us brothers according to the flesh, saying, I will tell of your name to my brothers. In the midst of the congregation, I will sing your praise. And then once again in verse 14, since therefore the children share in flesh and blood, He Himself likewise partook of the same things. Jesus became flesh and blood. God, in His love for humanity, sent His Son in human form. Paul speaks of this in Philippians chapter 2. And in verses 6 and 7, he describes that process of Jesus being born as a human being. He describes it in terms of His emptying Himself. That doesn't mean He gave up His divinity. We know that many times, even in human form, Jesus declared Himself to be divine, to be God. He was 100% God, but something changed when He was born. He also became 100% human. And it appears that He remains in that state, even seated at the right hand of God in heaven above. 1 Timothy chapter 2, verse 5 says, there is one God, and there is one mediator between God and men, the man, anthropos is the word there, the human being, Christ Jesus. That's a statement on His current condition. So think about that. Jesus came to earth and everything changed. He allowed Himself to undergo this change. He emptied Himself. He remained divine, but He took on humanity, became a human, remains a human, and mediates between God and man. This is the picture we see of Jesus in Hebrews chapter 2. Not just a God who took a form, who was superficially human, but who was actually a human being. This is the Jesus we see, a human being, maybe even a baby lying in a manger. Now why? Why was this necessary? Why did God choose to send His Son to earth in this form? Well, there's some very good reasons. First of all, humanity had to be restored to its rightful place. So we came to earth and we did not fulfill the divine mandate. We did not subdue the earth. We took the crown of glory and honor and cast it into the dust. But Jesus picked that crown up and He placed it upon His own head. And He showed us how to live. He showed us what a human being should be. He showed us how to love others, how to serve others, how to pray, how to worship. If you're ever having a problem understanding what your place in life is and how you should behave and how you should act, just look to Jesus. He left us an example that we should follow in His steps. But secondly, humanity had to die for sin. A representative of humanity had to die for sin. Animal sacrifices just didn't get the job done. Hebrews 10 verse 4 says, it is not possible for the blood of bulls and goats to take away sin. And so, over and over again, Hebrews 2 states that Jesus suffered in our place. Look at verse 9. He tasted death for everyone. And then in verse 10, the founder of our salvation was made perfect through suffering. And then verse 14, through death, He destroyed him who had the power of death, that is, the devil. So He died the death that we were meant to die because He represented us on the cross. No animal could do that. Only the blood of a man. Thirdly, the Son of God came to earth as a human. And He had to because humanity needed a qualified high priest. A priest offers sacrifices on behalf of people to God. Now, He does this as a mediator, as a go-between, bridging heaven and earth. And for that reason, He has to be one of the people that he represents. That's why in Israel, you don't see Egyptian priests or Ammonite priests or Midianite priests. The people serving Israel were Israelites, were brethren, because a priest has to be like the people he serves. For Jesus to qualify as our high priest, he had to take on flesh and blood. And so look at verses 17 and 18 of Hebrews chapter 2. Therefore he had to be made like his brothers in every respect, so that he might become a merciful and faithful high priest in the service of God to make propitiation for the sins of the people. For because he himself has suffered when tempted, he is able to help those who are being tempted. That's the picture we see of Jesus. We see a picture of the love of God, a sacrifice made for us that had to be. You may not see it. You may think, well, I don't understand why it had to be that way. God is God. He could do it any way He wanted. You may feel repulsed by the cross. You may think that kind of sacrifice is cruel, unnecessary. Look at verse 10. Hebrews 2 verse 10 says, "It was fitting that He, for whom and by whom all things exist, in bringing many sons to glory, should make the founder of their salvation perfect through suffering." It doesn't matter what you think. To God, for whom and by whom all things exist, for God, it was fitting. It was suitable. It's the only way. People want to be tolerant these days and include all religions. We're told you shouldn't try to evangelize the world or convert people from another religion to Christianity. We're all worshiping the same God. I mean, we're all just taking different paths to the same place, right? That's not what Hebrews 2 says. Hebrews 2 says, unless your faith is in the Son of God, who came to earth to live the human life and die as a human on the cross, who was raised, who ascended, who is seated at the right hand of the throne on high, unless your faith is in Him, you're lost. You have no hope. This is fitting. This is the way. So Jesus says in John 14:6, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. And the apostles declared in Acts 4 verse 12, there is salvation in no one else. There is no other name under heaven given among men by which we must be saved. It's fitting. And all other things, all other paths, all other faiths are inappropriate. They just don't work. They don't fit. I went with Ava on a field trip to DeSoto Caverns in Childersburg one time, and it's cave. And you've been on cave tours before. You know what they do. You get in there and they say, now this is one of the few places on earth where you can experience complete darkness. And so what we're going to do is we're going to have you all sit down, and we want you to power down your devices, turn off all your equipment that might produce light, and we're going to shut the lights off, and we're going to feel what it's like to be in complete darkness. You can't experience this above ground. There's always the moon, stars, or artificial light. There's always something that keeps you from experiencing this. This is a unique opportunity, so everybody cooperate, right? So they count down, 1, 2, 3, shut the lights off, and there's this glow in the midst of the crowd coming from a woman's cell phone. I know she heard the instructions, or maybe she didn't because she was texting, but she destroyed the experience of complete darkness for everyone who was there. And people got angry, understandably so. Why? She was doing something that was totally inappropriate. She had her own idea of how things should be done. She thought it was a good time to play with her phone. I don't even know how she got service down there, but she's a pretty good service provider. But what she did destroyed the whole picture. Nobody else could experience it because she had her own way. Now, in the same way that a smartphone is not fitting to the experience of complete darkness. Any other plan, any other faith, any other religion or prophet or book is not fitting for the salvation of humanity. Only Christ, the man, Jesus. We see Jesus. This, friends, Hebrews chapter 2, this is the picture, the truth, the reality. If we put our faith in anything else, we're hopelessly lost. And we see the picture of what should have been, but wasn't. We see the picture of the love of God. Let's turn to the hope in the third place of the picture of what could be. What could be for you and for me. Verse 15 speaks of slavery. We've been talking about humanity, our humanity, Jesus' humanity. Nothing is more dehumanizing than slavery. Slavery is exchanging people as property and owning people as if they're property, as if they have no soul, as if they haven't been made in the image of God. And so this country and countries all over the world had to and have to abolish slavery because it destroys people's humanity, their dignity, their basic individual rights. Slavery was a scourge that afflicted this country for many years. And the American slaves, they did something to maintain their dignity during that time. They used folklore and art and music and faith to entertain liberty and to maintain their dignity, even though they were enslaved. They may not have been able to escape physically, but they escaped spiritually, emotionally, mentally within. We have some examples. For example, they brought a rich folklore over from Africa into America. Stories they would tell their children that reminded them of their human dignity. And they had these colorful characters in the stories like Brer Rabbit, a defenseless creature, powerless against those oppressing him, except he used his wit and his guile instead of his power to escape the people who oppressed him. Another popular figure was the traveling man. They would tell stories about people who were so fast that nobody could catch them. There's one story about a man who was carrying a pail of water for 2.25 miles. He tripped, spilled the water, ran back home, got another pail, and got back in time to catch the water before it fell to the ground. That's how fast they were. One story I heard that has always fascinated me, it was told by the slaves in the South, was about a group of slaves who were weary from their oppression, who put corn cobs in their armpits and said magic words and floated into the air and flew east to home in Africa. And there are many variations on the story. One variation has them floating in circles, slow at first, faster and faster and faster, until they flew home. Of course, they had spirituals as well. Songs we still sing in church today. Songs like Go Down Moses, which has the refrain, let my people go. They would sing those songs and it would remind them of how God delivered the Egyptians, and perhaps He might deliver them from oppression also. And if not in this life, their faith told them that they would escape in the life to come and finally be free. Now, we've never had to rely on art and stories and music to maintain our dignity, not in that way anyway. That was a survival mechanism that they developed. And American history is rich with all of those folk tales and songs. And with that faith, they were able to maintain their human dignity despite that slavery. But there is a slavery that is so oppressive that without Christ there is no escape, without or within. There's no story or art or music that can release us in the absence of Jesus Christ. And the slavery I speak of is mentioned in verse 15. The fear of death. The lifelong slavery we all know. The slavery of the fear of death. From that, friends, without Jesus Christ, there is no escape. But the text says that through death, He destroyed him who had the power of death, that is the devil. The devil uses that fear as a tool to make us subhuman, to make us afraid, to keep us on the cursed ground, to convince us that God doesn't exist, or if He does exist, He doesn't care anything about us. And so why love others? Why serve others? In this life, we get what we can grab hold of and hold on tightly until we're gone. And Jesus destroyed all of that through His own death and released us from that craven fear, that slavery. That doesn't mean death is easy now. It doesn't mean that at all. And death is difficult, but we can face it. We're not enslaved by it. It doesn't have to control us. Jesus gave us that power. He's the one that set us free. And before we go, there's one last statement made in verse 16 that we have to touch on before we can conclude. While he's speaking of what could be, we can be released. We don't have to be enslaved by this fear. We can maintain our dignity. We can be what God meant for us to be. He says in verse 16, surely it is not angels that He helps, but He helps the offspring of Abraham. Do you understand how extraordinary that statement is? He could have said it this way: Jesus didn't come to earth as an angel. He came to earth as a human being like you and me. And He didn't die on the cross as an angel for the sins of angels. He died on the cross for the sins of you and me. And so the angels, they have no hope. They have no gospel. Just we humans. Now the angels can beat us in just about every contest. Peter says in 2 Peter chapter 2, verse 11, they're stronger in might than we are, more powerful than we are. But when it comes to redemption, we have something they cannot boast of. Redemption through Jesus Christ, a Savior who was a man. And angels have sinned. Peter writes about the angels who sinned, who weren't spared, but God cast them into hell and committed them to gloomy chains of darkness to be kept until the judgment, 2 Peter chapter 2, verse 4. Most likely, the devil himself, who appears in this text, he started out as an angel, rebelled against heaven, and was cast down. And maybe that's why he wants to keep us in the fear of death, because he himself has no hope. But we have hope. We don't have to remain cursed. We don't have to be held down by the chains of this cursed ground. But Christ restores us to what we once were, redeems humanity, because He Himself became a human being. Yes, He was born and He was laid in a manger, but He grew into a man. And He died for us. And He rose again to show us that we too have that same destiny if we'll just only choose it. And the angels are very interested in what we do with this picture of Jesus. Peter says, these are things into which angels long to look. 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 12. They're looking at you. And what do they see? Do they see someone who has sinned? Yes. Who forsook the original divine mandate to subdue the earth and be crowned with glory and honor? Yes, that's what they see in each and every one of us. All have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. But do they see someone who's given another chance? Through Emmanuel, God with us, and who rejected that opportunity? Or do they see someone who has enough faith to say, I believe that Jesus is the Son of God and that He died for my sins? And someone who has been lowered into the waters of baptism and raised to walk in newness of life, is that who they see in you? Is that who they will see in you? Is that who you continue to be? And if you need any help, we're here, we're waiting, we want to lead you further in your walk with Christ. Why not come as we stand and as we sing?